like David, I could say, once I was young, but now I'm old. You know, I don't feel old. I feel about 16 or 17. Remember those days at Avondale, Doug, you know? I was a bit older than 17, but I haven't progressed much past that. But I want to talk to you about this morning, to start off with, about this old man who came out of the desert, and he went into this area where there were 4 million people. Now, I can't tell you much about him except that he was a priest of God, and he came out of the desert, and he had at least one of his 7 daughters with him, and he had 2 of his grandchildren. Does anyone know who I'm talking about? Yeah, that's right. And so we know his name, it was Jethro, and it says that he was a priest of the Most High God, so he worshipped God. He was a descendant of Abraham. And so it was very good that he was a worshipper, as a monolithic worshipper, or no, whatever that word is I'm trying to find. And he worshipped God, but he kind of had much esteem, people may not have thought much of him. He certainly wasn't a good farmer. He had 7 daughters, so they did the farming for him. So stand up, ladies, because you're good farmers. And that was sort of traditional in the Bible. We know of people who farmed, looked after the sheep for their family and other places. But his 7 daughters looked after the sheep. And one day they were looking after the sheep, and this Egyptian came in. Now, when they went to get the water for their sheep, the men said, "Oh, you're only women, get to the back of the queue." And so when Moses came down, he saw that happening, and he said, "No, they're in line, and I'm going to draw the water for them." And he did that. 7 daughters went home, and instead of getting home at 5 o'clock at night, they'd read the union rules. They actually got home at 3:30, and their father, who had also read the union rules, said, "What are you doing home so early?" And they said, "Well, we're home so early because this man helped us, and he watered the sheep for us, and he told the other Midianites that we were to be treated fairly, and that meant that we had to get the water for the sheep." So he said, the father said, "Well, where is he? You know, why haven't you brought it home? If he was so good to you and did all these things, why did you leave him out there in the desert?" So they went back out, and he came home, and he stayed with the man who was going to become his father-in-law, which was interesting because he did marry one of the 7 daughters. Now, I don't know where she was in line. But so we know that he most probably wasn't a very effective farmer because he got his daughters doing that. And we know that he most probably wasn't a very good priest because if he was a priest of any standing, they would have stood aside while his daughters went and got the water for the sheep. But that didn't happen. But anyway, he came out of the desert, and he had one of his daughters and 2 children, and they came to this plain just before the big mountain there. And it was very good. Moses had led the people out of Israel. They had seen all these miracles while they were out of Egypt. While they were in Egypt, they'd seen all these miracles that God had provided. You know, and when the plague of darkness came through, every Israelite house was lit up. Now, I think if I was an Egyptian, I would have made friends with the Israelites because at least they had light, and the Egyptians were in darkness. But they saw these 10 miracles happen. The Egyptians didn't think they were miracles. The Egyptians thought they were plagues. But the Israelites thought that they were wonderful miracles. So, you know, and I know that Jethro brought his wife in, Moses' wife, because it says that he brought his wife and the 2 grandsons with him, and they met up with Moses. Now, it was most probably too dangerous for Moses to take his wife and family into Egypt when he went to call the Israelites out. Now, I use the word 4 million. I don't know how many there were, but somebody else said there were 4 million, so I'm just trusting on that. The population of New Zealand in front of Mount Sinai seems a bit stretched, but there was a lot of people there, a lot of people, and Moses had been looking after all these people. You know, So they were now quite safe, and so Jethro thought it was time to reunite Moses with his family. So he did that. But as he came down into the Israelite camp, all he heard was what? Were the Israelites happy? Or were they? You know, they said, oh, that we had perished back there in Egypt amongst the flesh pots of Egypt where we had meat to eat and we had all these things, and now you brought us out here. And if they'd looked up in the middle of the day, what would they have seen? Well, had that been there before? No. At night, as they looked around, what would they have seen? Fire. Who put that there? God. So whatever way they looked at, they saw the providence of God and all these things, but they turned their back on that. You know, they had seen the 10 plagues, they had seen the destruction of the Egyptian army, they had seen the miracle of the water, that Moses had been able to get water for them so that they were well watered. They were well aware of every morning they went out into the desert and there was their food for the day. It didn't matter how much that they gathered, they just had enough and they just felt okay. So they had that manna, and that night they had the quails coming in, and so they were able to have the meat that they so earnestly desired. So they were aware that God provided them for them every day. You know, the manna, if they kept it overnight, it became rotten and smelt. It had worms in it. But on Friday night, and Friday when they picked it up, on Sabbath morning it was still good to eat. So, I mean, that's got to be a miracle. God didn't give each one of them a refrigerator to put it in. It was just kept in their tents overnight. They had seen evidence when the 12 spies had come back. 2 of them were carrying a bunch of grapes, available at $2 a kilo from Coles. But, you know, they carried this bunch of grapes between 2 men. Can you imagine how heavy those grapes were? They'd seen the spies report, the land is flowing with milk and honey, everything is great, but how often we are paralyzed by the buts in our lives. So they'd seen that, but they still didn't want to go up and take it over. They complained all the time. And, you know, the people of Israel were not like Moses, who preferred to lead this rebellious people with God with them than stay in Egypt and be a Pharaoh, because he was in line for being a Pharaoh. He much preferred to be with the rebellious people, God's people, with God's spirit with them, than he did to stay as king of Egypt. They weren't like, Daniel, who much preferred being in a lion's den with lions, with the Spirit of God, than being the Prime Minister of the land. They weren't like, they weren't like Joseph, who preferred to be in prison with the Spirit of God rather than free and being accused of adultery. They weren't like the 3 worthy Hebrews who would spend their time in a fiery furnace with Jesus with them than they would with just sitting out there without God praising a statue. These Israelites were just a pack of whingy or whining whingers. Can you imagine? We're not like that, are we? No. So, you know. So now Jethro had come to visit and he was there. So he heard the complaints. But the most wonderful thing is he sat down and he talked to Moses. Guess what Moses talked about? He talked about the wonderful things that God had done. He talked about the positiveness of what God had done. He talked about the manna and how the sea had been parted and they'd walked through on dry land. And Jethro was so excited about what God had done. Guess what he wanted to do? He said, I want to go. It's up there too. I know. He wanted to go up there. And he wanted to go out and he wanted to sacrifice to the Lord God Almighty, because his whole enthusiasm for God had now been ignited as Moses talked to him about wonderful things that had happened to him. Now my question is this. What happens when you tell people about your story? Do they want to go and do they want to worship the Most High God? Do they want to give sacrifice? Do they want to go along to the church and praise God? Do they want to do these things? And I'm sorry to bore you, but some of you will have heard some of the story already. But I'm going to tell it again. I was raised a Presbyterian. And as soon as I was old enough, along with piano lessons, God went out of my life. As soon as I was old enough to assert my authority, I said to my mother, I don't want to go back to church there any longer. I've got too many good things to do in my life, and I don't want to spend time wasting time at church, because that's what I saw it as. And my mother agreed. I couldn't believe it. My father was from the Orkney Islands, and he was a member of the Free Church of Scotland. And he was interesting. He kept the Sabbath on Sunday. We weren't allowed to do anything on Sunday, but at lunchtime I was allowed to go and buy a pint of ice cream. Remember pints? A pint of ice cream and the Sunday Star Sports. And Dad would send that in the afternoon. We weren't allowed to play or anything like that, but anyway. So I thought, well, okay, so I was, I guess, about 11 or 12 at the time, so I stopped going to church. And I think my mother breathed a sigh of relief. But my Uncle Harry, who had Seventh-day Adventist connections, used to come around and he would play drafts with my father. My father hated Seventh-day Adventists. And yet Harry and my father were the best of friends, and they would sit there, they would play drafts on a Sunday night, and they would listen to the broadcast of the local church, local whatever, they used to have turns. And what I liked about it is that my father would rub my back, and I'd sit there and he would rub my back, and it was so nice playing drafts. My father was a very quiet man. Uncle Harry was very talkative, you can see where I got it from. And even though Dad didn't like Seventh-day Adventists, he really liked Uncle Harry's talkability. My dad was a very quiet man, as I said, and I was very surprised that these two were great mates, and they really were. So that was my early response. I enjoyed being a Presbyterian. I can still remember the children's stories. I can remember things that happened. But when I went to a school in Invercargill called James Hargis High School. It was a brand new co-ed school. I loved it because there were girls there. I lived right over the road from a boys' high school. I could walk over the road, and my brother used to, and he could walk home and have morning and afternoon tea and lunch. Now, what did thick head here have to do? I went to James Hargis High School, 3 miles away, and excuse me, my parents didn't know I was booked in for there. But I got into big trouble when we went to, Bill, could you get me a glass of water? Out there. When I went to get the school uniform, and my mother said, boys' high uniform, and I said, no, James Hargis. She said to the shopkeeper, I think we need to go home and discuss this. I'll be back later. I ended up going to James Hargis. I was spoiled, Alison, wasn't I? Yeah, that's what my older brother and sister say too. I was spoiled rotten. But anyway, I loved James Hargis. I had a great time. I was there for 7 years and did almost 7 years, and did what most people did in 4. I had a great social time, didn't do much learning. Oh, I did a lot of learning, but I was no good at putting it out. But I just loved it, the social thing. And when I was 14 and a half, I had saved enough money, and I wanted to go and buy a car. And my mother said, oh, I don't know if that's on. And hello, I know they charge rates, but to measure water is stupid. Excuse me. Thanks, Brother Bill. Anyway, so I wanted this car, and I went out one Sunday night and I bought an Austin 7. I was 14 and a half, and I got it driven home, and my parents said, "You're not driving that till you're 15, till you've got your license." I said, "No, I know that." So the following morning I got up, I said, "I want to take the car to school," and my mum said, "You're not taking." I said, "I've got someone else to drive her, she's got a license." So for 6 months I got driven to school in this little old Austin 7. In 1937 it was black and it was wonderful and I loved it. First car, it was just great. But I had no money. I couldn't go to mum and dad and say, "Could I have some money to support the car?" And they said, "Well, you bought it, you support it." So I thought, what can I do? So I started a babysitting service. Now, I tell you, until I was 22, I was an expert on babies. And then I had my own. And I could find out I wasn't an expert. But I had such wonderful time being a babysitter provider. It was just great. Sometimes I had 40 people out on a Saturday night babysitting, and they would pay me a percentage. I thought, if God can charge 10%, I can also. So they used to come up to me and give me 10% at church, at school. And then I sold my beloved Austin 7 and I bought a little 1934 Austin 10 pickup ute. And I looked at it and I thought, what possibilities are there here? Sawdust. I could sell sawdust, so I did. I sold seaweed and I started mowing lawns. And I was earning more money than the freezing workers, who were earning more money than the doctors in the place. So I was reasonably well off. I don't know what happened. I got married, I think, and that fixed that. Anyway, it was all very interesting, and I just had this wonderful thing with living. My childhood was just blessed and wonderful, and we had no money, but it was just great. We lived in a lovely house. It was just wonderful. I can't praise my parents enough for what they provided for us. My brother and sister had a different concept of this, but I think it was just so good. And they thought it was good too, but from a different point of view. Anyway, so things progressed, and they made me a prefect by popular vote. So all the people had to stand up and turn around, but I did a complete 360, and people remembered that, and they all voted for me. And the director said, "You'll be prefect, David, over my dead body." I said, "Well, we can arrange that if you want us to, But anyway, they made me a prefect, and again, that was really good. I tried to be helpful and kind. They made me the bell ringer. If I was liking the lesson we were having, the bell would be rung a couple of minutes late, and if it was not so good, it would be rung a couple of minutes early. So at the end of 2 years, they thought something was going on, so they put in an automatic bell ringer, and that's saved me a job. But as I say, it was just great. But they had a prefect camp, and they got all the prefects from all the local schools, and we went out to a little place called Riverton, and we had this prefect camp, and Reverend Old came along to talk about the religious connotations of us as leaders in our school, and he proceeded to get up. It was in the afternoon, I remember, and he was a Methodist minister, and he got up and he totally rubbished Christianity. And I stood up and I said to him, "Now look, Reverend Old," and he said, "Yeah." I said, "You can't do this." And he said, "Why?" I said, "Because you're God's man, and all you're doing is running him down. How can you do that? How can you justify that?" And he said, "Well, God gave us a brain, and we're meant to use it to work everything through." And I said, "Well, but you're working it through negatively. What happened about the faith?" And he run down creation, the virgin birth, the leading of, all the things that we believe in. He just totally rubbished it. Anyway, I stood up and it started a debate, which went on for about 4 months as we went around the different schools, as we did, because we were raising money for our gymnasium. So we would debate with the different schools, and I started all sorts of things. All these kids would say, "Well, my father's a priest, not a Catholic priest, in the Anglican Church. He'd like to talk to you." So I went and talked to him. The Jehovah's Witnesses, I went to see them, and their church services, but I found them totally boring and not very interesting at all. Sorry if there's any Jehovah's Witnesses here, but their songs were, And anyway, one day I was walking down the main road. I guess I was I don't know, 18 or 19. I walked down the main road and there was the big sign, "Dead men do tell tales." Heard of that? And I heard this music. It was Sunday evening and I heard this music. It was wonderful music. And I go in there and I said to Mrs. Hill, who I knew, "Can I go and listen to the music?" "Sure," she said, "come in." I said, "Cost anything?" No, it's free. And so I went in and there was a guy called Alan Lindsay and he was preaching. And I tell you, this was in 1964 and I can tell you, I don't know what he had. But I sat there and I listened to him and I thought, I don't know what you've got, but what you've got, I want. And so I went along and my mother went along and I think in October, her and I along with 18 others were baptised. There was 3 Bewses. An auntie of mine who I had nothing to do with, she was actually baptised the same day I was. But I think Alan Lindsay raised the limit of the church, the number in church, from about 150 to over 210. So it was really an exciting time. It was wonderful. So I became a Seventh-day Adventist. And I have to say, in my social activities at high school, it involved taking young ladies out. I was pure, don't get me wrong, but I liked the company of young ladies. And so I used to invite all the pretty ones out because they never got invited out. Everyone was too shy to invite them out. So I wasn't too shy and I didn't mind being told no. So I used to go and invite them out and they'd go, "Oh, okay, yeah." And I had a car, which no one else had. So I was quite a catch, really. And so I came into the Seventh-day Adventist church and I looked around everyone and I thought, okay, what's going to happen here? And nothing happened, really, except I found these people to be absolutely wonderful. In 1960, I had gone to my first camp meeting, 4 years before I became a Seventh-day Adventist, and I found these crazy, and I mean crazy young people at a camp meeting. What was that all about? And I loved it. I thought, hey, there are other crazy people around. This is so wonderful. I can join this mob sometime. Anyway, I did in 1964, and I just had such a wonderful time with my Christianity and joining the church. But anyway, one day I walked into the church, and you've all heard this story, I know, so I'll keep it very brief. And here was this vision of loveliness. And her name was, I said to my good friend Max Wilson, I said, "Who's that?" And he said, I know how the Israelites felt when they found water in the desert, actually. And he said, her name is Rosalie Tasker. He said, and she's staying at my place, would you like to come home for lunch? I said, wild horses wouldn't keep me apart. So anyway, I discovered that she had 3 other boyfriends, so I joined the list, and it took me about 4 months to get rid of the other 3. But we did that, and we started going together as a couple. And I was in love, and it was really great. But then I worked for the NZBC as a copywriter, and I was so endowed by my talents that they wanted to send me to Rotorua where no one else would go, so that I could be a copyright salesman up there. So, I missed that out. Thank you. Where was I? Copywriter, Rotorua. That's right. So I said to Rosalie, I'm talking about going to Rotorua. And my mother was astounded that I'd even think about going to Rotorua. So I thought about it and I thought, well, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to learn to be a teacher. I'm going to become a primary school teacher. The 2 groups of people I did not like were pastors and teachers. So why I wanted to be a teacher, I have no idea. But however, it was just such a good time. So anyway, I said to Rosalie, I'm going to Avondale, do you want to come? And she said, look, David, I've already been thrown out of every other Seventh-day Adventist institution in New Zealand, so I don't want to do every Adventist institution in Australasia. So no, I'm not going to go. So we didn't have a big argument. We just broke up. She stayed in Invercargill. I went to Avondale. She married a David. I was at Avondale for 4 days. And I met another Rosalie McHugh. And that night, I proposed to her. And she said, no way. It was in a Jacaranda meeting. and I thought Pastor Heffern was going to die, but she was the staid 4th year education student. They wouldn't take me for education, so I had to do accountancy. So, but you can see I haven't got the personality for that, so that didn't work. And anyway, in August she said yes, and then we got married. And 3rd of January 1968. So, and I have to say, it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. We had a great life together, and Rosalie was pregnant 15 times. She had 15 pregnancies, and I remember the first one that failed. I tell you, it was so bad. It was a Friday night. I was mowing the lawns in this little place that we had just bought. I had chosen it was a dump. And from then on, I let Rosalie choose wherever we were going to live. But she came to the door and she said, "David, I'm bleeding." So we rushed to the hospital, and that was the first miscarriage. Now, some of you know what this is like, but 15 pregnancies, 5 live births, and 2 of those children died. One, our oldest one, Karen, she lived till she was 3.5, and she had spina bifida. And she was a very bad case, and the doctors said she'll never do anything, but she was just brilliant until she had a stroke at 3 and died at 3.5 with complications with the spina bifida. And then we used to go to church, and all these people would talk about, the horrors of the kids, kids are so, and we'd wonder what on earth's going on. And then we had Leanne, and we knew what they were talking about. So we had Leanne, and then we had Joel, and then we had Justin. And Justin was also a spina bifida, and he died at 1 month of age. And I used to go and visit him every day. The nurses were so nice in the hospital. I went down there one day, and they put him out. It was a cold winter's morning, and he was in a white pram, and they'd done him up in white, and someone had got a rose. And he had his little hand in a glove, holding on. They'd taken the thorns off it, and he was holding on to this rose. I tell you, it's really... It was made a really lasting impression on me, but he was my little boy that I loved dearly. Hadn't got to know him, and he was dying. Karen, our oldest, she was just phenomenal. Some people would look at her and say, she's got squint eyes and all that, but she was just a phenomenal little girl, and she was just tremendous. And so Justin died at the end of a month, and then we tried very hard, and we had Rochelle, and some of you will know Rochelle. And, I don't like death. I don't like death at all. And when you sit and watch your children and your wife die, it's not really a nice thing. I know some of you have been through that. And, but it was a privilege for me to have known, and people have said to me, "Would you change anything?" No, I wouldn't. It was just such a wonderful, wonderful thing. And then about this time I started business. I had a shirt and jean bar. Now, I was voted the worst dressed student in the high school I went to. Now, that's pretty tough to do when you're in school uniform. But I managed to do it. So I started this business called the Shirt and Jean Bar. And I ended up owing equivalent of about $1.5 million in today's money. It was $110,000. It took me 10 years to pay off the debt. My accountant and my solicitor said, "Go bankrupt." And I said, "No, I'm not going to. I'm going to stay with it." And so I did. And I had I still got it at home, the schedule, and I used to pay checks out every month. And, we used to, I remember sitting down one day, I was a hawker as well. I used to go door to door selling clothes. And I remember sitting down, there were 5, I think, vehicles at my place, and not one of them would go. Flat tyres, flat battery, no petrol, unregistered, and I had no money. I had no money, and I sat down and I cried. And I said to Rosie, "What sort of husband and provider am I when I put us into this huge debt?" And she said, "Love," she said, "I didn't marry you to make lots of money." She said, "I married you to be with you. It doesn't matter what the situation is." She said, "I'm so pleased that I've still got you." How could you not love a wife like that? Isn't that just wonderful? And so we looked at things, we did the right thing. We tithed. We went to camp every year. We were vegetarians. We put our children in church school. I mean, what more could we do? God, what are we doing wrong? You know? I never blamed God in any of this because it was for stupid decisions that I had made. And they were stupid. How I dealt with things were not really good. So I just used to think to myself, well, I'm in debt. I've just got to work harder and harder and harder and get out of this. And all this time, I used to go to church every Sabbath, and we had our children, and it was just that part of life. I had Rose there, and it was just really great. Wonderful life, just absolutely wonderful. But, you know, some of you won't even know what I'm talking about, but when you've got absolutely not any money at all. I always wanted to be a millionaire by the time I was 30. By the time I was 30, I owed $1 million. So, you know, I was a millionaire in negative. So it's just a terrible thing. So I sat down with Rosalie one day, and she was the one that was good with the little pictures in the drawing. And she sat down and she drew me a series of little pictures. And she wrote a book by she read a book by an Anglican minister who had written about Seventh-day Adventists. I've just forgotten the name of it. And it actually changed my whole way of thinking about God. I still tithed, I was still a vegetarian, I still supported our health system. What was the other thing I did? I still went to camp. From 1960 till 1989 till we come to Australia, we never missed one camp. And it was hard. We had to get in this, we had a Hillman Imp at one stage, 3 adults, 2 children, a little trailer and all our stuff to go camping in Christchurch, 355 miles. We didn't run out of petrol, we ran out of water. So I had to stop in the middle of the night so we could get the water. But, you know, all these things. And I said to Rosalie, you know, why is this happening? So she sat down and she drew these pictures, you know. And, you know, we discovered it wasn't what we were doing or what I had done that counted. What counted was the fact that Jesus, many years ago, came and died on Calvary so that we could have the ability to talk to him all the time. God's not Santa Claus, and this is the picture I had. If I do all these things, if I'm a good boy, God will reward me with this and this and this and this. But when Rosie drew this little series of pictures, I no longer thought of God as Santa Claus. I thought of him as the most wonderful God who loved me eternally. You know, it was those nails that went through his living flesh. That's what saved me. That's what saved you. It's not how good or bad you and I are. It's what Jesus did for us on Calvary that matters, and our relationship to that. There's no buts in Christianity. But if I'm a good boy, I will get these things. It doesn't happen. You know, I've said it before and I've got to repeat it again. We had Pastor DeVille, and he used to say, justified, just as if I had never sinned. And that was about the same time, you know, and it was just so good to suddenly have this wonderful relationship explained to me that God loved me tremendously. You know, for the stupid decisions I had made wasn't God's fault. He gave me free choice, and I had made the decisions, and so I had to look around. See, the problem is we spend millions of dollars to find out whose problem this here is. Why did that happen? I'm talking about a government. And really, all we have to do is for someone to get up and say, well, it was my fault, I did it. Imagine how much money would be saved. You know, God should not be blamed for the decisions that you and I make, but we should blame ourselves because, you know, whereas God is leading us and God takes our decisions and he uses them to our best advantage. Now, that's what I found about God, that he does all these things for our best use. We make stupid mistakes, but God takes that and makes them into wonderful experiences. You know, I read stories in the Bible, and it's just great. was the story of the buried treasure. No, the man went in and he dug in the field, and what did he find? He found treasure beyond belief. And he didn't go and say, oh, look, I found this treasure in this field, you know. He covered it back up very carefully. And he went and he sold, it says he sold everything that he had. And he went back and he bought the treasure. Now, there's many ways of looking at that. But you know who the treasure was? That treasure was you. And the great God in heaven came down to claim you. He sold everything that he had. He gave away the courts and glory. He gave away the fact that he could be everywhere at once. He gave all that away, and he came down and hung on the cross so that you could spend eternity with him. No, isn't that just great? My current girlfriend, Rosalie, who's Rosalie Tasker, who was the first girl I used to go with in Invercargill, just to make sure that's all right. It came through this morning. I just happened to check the Facebook, and it said, you know, I am who God says I am. And he says this about you. He said, you are anointed. God has anointed you. You are equipped. God has equipped you. You are redeemed. God has redeemed you. And you are tremendously blessed. Now, even though I had no money back there and I still haven't got a lot of money, it's just wonderful. I mean, I get, you know, nice clothes. And I think it's just amazing what God has done for me. And all I can say, that he will do the same for you. But it's not what we do, it is what God has done for us. You know, he's provided salvation away so that we can spend eternity. Hey, isn't that going to be good? Eternity with the great God in heaven. I see some of you smiling and nodding. And I think, how good is that? You know, eternity, that's forever and ever and ever without end. We don't need to worry about money. We don't need to worry about any of these silly things, because God is going to be the fount of all things for us in that place. And so we will continue to make stupid mistakes. I will continue to make stupid mistakes. And God will take the best of it and use it to his purpose. And I think that's just so wonderful, you know. How is it possible not to love a God like that? Thank you. Our Father, you are indeed a great God. You're a wonderful God. And we know that there is a day of judgment coming, that all the world will be judged. But you are our friend. And as our friend, we have you as our judge. And as our friend, we have you as our Saviour, our defence counsel. And as our friend, we just love you forever. Please help us to go from this place with the full portion of your Spirit, that we might be able to tell others about what a wonderful, wonderful God you are. And help us, Lord, in all things that we do, that we don't give people the wrong impression about how much you love us. Because I ask this, please, in your Son's precious name. Amen.